In preparation for our third class, Brother Dan has asked that we would read Ruth chapter 2. Ruth chapter 2. Now Naomi had a kinsman of her husband, a man of great wealth of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, "Please let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after one in whose sight I may find favor." And she departed to her, "Go, my daughter." So she departed and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the portion of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. Now behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said to the reapers, "May the Lord be with you." And they said to him, "May the Lord bless you." Then Boaz said to his servant, who was in charge of the reapers, "Whose young man is this?" The servant in charge of the reapers replied, "She is the young Moabite woman who returned with Naomi from the land of Moab." And she said, "Please let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves." Thus she came, and she remained from the morning until now. She had been sitting in the house for a little while. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Listen carefully, my daughter. Do not go to glean in another field. Furthermore, do not go on from this, but stay here with my maids. Let your eyes be on the field which they reap, and go after them. Indeed, I have commanded the servants not to touch you. When you are thirsty, go to the water jars and drink from what the servants draw." Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your sight that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" Boaz replied to her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law after the death of your husband has been fully reported to me, and how you left your father and your mother and the land of your birth and came to a people that you did not previously know. May the Lord reward your work and your wages be full from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wing you have come to seek refuge." Then she said, "I have found favor in your sight, my Lord, for you have comforted me, indeed have spoken kindly to your maidservant, that I am not like one of your maidservants." At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come here, that you may eat of the bread and dip your piece of bread in the vinegar." So she sat beside the reapers, and he served her roasted grain, and she ate and was satisfied and had some left. When she rose to glean, Boaz commanded his servant, saying, "Let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not insult her. Also you shall purposely pull out from her some grain from the bundles, and leave it that she may glean, and do not rebuke her." So she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. She took it up and went into the city, and her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also took it out and gave Naomi, which she had left after she was satisfied. Her mother-in-law then said to her, "Why do you glean today, and where did you work? May he who took notice of you be blessed." So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked, and said, "The name of the man with whom I have worked today is Boaz." Naomi said to her, "Daughter-in-law, may he be blessed of the Lord, who has not withdrawn his kindness to the living and to the dead." Again, Naomi said to her, "The man is our relative. He is one of our closest relatives." Then Ruth the Moabitess said, "Furthermore, he said to me, 'You should stay close to my servants until they have finished all your harvest.'" Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It is good, my daughter, that you go out with her maids, so that others do not fall upon you in another field." So she stayed close by the maids of Boaz in order to glean until the end of the barley harvest and the wheat harvest, and she lived with her mother-in-law. This is the Vernon Study Day, January 2020, led by our brother Dan Ledbetter. His overall topic is Ruth. This is class number 3. It's titled, "In Whose Sight I Shall Find Grace," and the reading was Ruth chapter 2. And with that, I'll call Brother Dan to the front.
Yahweh be with you. That's the greeting that Boaz gives to his reapers as he comes to them in the field. The response, Yahweh bless thee. When we see each other on a Sunday morning, on a Tuesday night Bible class, or on a study weekend, or a Bible school after a long time away one from another, and we come across and we greet each other, what's our first thought? Do they remember me? How have they been? Do we still get along? How's our relationship going? Often, I'd suggest, our first thought is about the relationship that we have with each other. But that's not the way it is for Boaz or his people. The first thought that they have is, how is your relationship with God? It's a small thing, it's a subtle thing, but I think it's important we see each other, that becomes our first thought. It's, how are you doing with God? How is that relationship? Yahweh be with you. Yahweh bless you. Those things only happen when we're walking hand in hand with God. Those things don't happen when our relationship with God is lacking or gone. So that's the focus of the family of Boaz. That's how he taught his household to behave and to think. It's a great example for us in how we think about each other and what our focus should be. Also, thank you very much for the food this afternoon. It was excellent. And thank you for the desserts. I love sweet things. And it was really, really good. So that being said, we're going to continue on our story in Ruth. We ended it off that they just got into Bethlehem. It's the beginning of barley harvest. And Ruth had made this commitment to God. She was steadfastly minded to stick to the truth. She made that mental change in her life. And what needs to follow is a moral change. Because as we talked about last class, it's not about what we say, but it's about what we do. So that mental distinction we make, that mental desire to serve God, has to follow through in the way we live our lives. It has to be shown in our moral application of God's principles. And again, we think of the story, what's going on? These two women have just traveled after the death of loved ones through the land of Moab and back to Bethlehem. Two women by themselves. In a time where it would be difficult for women to work and travel by themselves. They didn't have a lot of things. It would have been a hard journey, an emotional journey, especially for Ruth as she left her entire family behind, never to see them again. And also for Naomi, realizing she's coming back into the Ecclesia, right, back to the place that she left 10 years ago. But she'd come back, in her mind, empty-handed. Right? The people in the meeting would see that. They'd say, well, where's everybody else? It wasn't an easy thing. They got home. They talked to the brothers and sisters in the meeting. They go to bed that night in an empty house, a house that had been left vacant for 10 years. They just move into these one young woman and one older woman. They have nothing. Next day comes, and whether you want it to or not, life carries on. Trials keep coming into our lives. It doesn't stop because it's inconvenient for us. And look at Ruth's reaction. The very next morning, after leaving her family behind, being thrown in a situation that would not have been totally accepting at first. I'd like to believe that it would, but it wouldn't have been. Never mind that she was a Moabitess, but she was coming into a group of people that would look at her with suspicion. Well, why is she here? And where's Mahlon and Chilion? Where's Elimelech? Why is this woman here and not them? So that mental choice has to be shown in moral action. So what's the first thing that Ruth does in verse 2 of Ruth 2? And Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi the very next morning, let me now go into the field and glean ears of corn after him in whose sight I shall find grace. Her first thought is not to wallow in self-pity. Oh, I miss home. I wonder how mom and dad are doing. My brother's having a kid. No, her first thought is, I'm going to go to work. I'm going to apply my hands to service, to look after Naomi, to provide for her. She freely gave her time. Brothers and sisters, when we come into the meeting on a Sunday, is our first thought about, what can I do? How can I help this morning? What way can I find to provide service for my brothers and sisters? That's the spirit of Ruth. That's her first thought. Her first thinking is, what can I do for other people? Well, that really is the nugget at the center of the atonement, isn't it? It's what we can do for other people, having an outward look instead of an inward look. And Ruth manifests that. She morally shows the principles that she's committed herself to. And she goes in and she's looking. And it says there that she's looking to find someone in whose sight she might find grace. It's also in chapter 2 that we're introduced into Boaz. And we know Boaz stands for our Lord Jesus Christ. It's interesting the way he's introduced. We're told that Naomi had a kinsman of her husband's, a mighty man of wealth of the family of Elimelech, and his name was Boaz. So just a couple quick things. The word there for kinsman is not the same word you see as kinsman redeemer later on in the book. It just means a friend, an acquaintance. So what we learn about Boaz is that he was not only related to Elimelech and to Naomi, but he was a friend of the family. They got along. They were associates. But he was also of the family of Elimelech. Now, the Hebrew word for family is the word mishpacha, and it literally means a circle of relatives. Why? Why is it defined that way? What is the way of thinking behind that phrase, a circle of relatives? Well, again, it goes back to the lifestyle of the nomad, where the Hebrew culture grew from. Because as you went with your family, think of Abraham, dwelling in tents up and down the land, and when you stopped for the night, you would put your tents into a circle, and that would be your family circle. That's why the Hebrew word for family means a circle of relatives, because that's how they would put themselves down for rest, and that's how they would live in this circle. Same way you think of in our Western culture of circling the wagons, the same idea. That's how they traveled. That's how they lived together. It's that family circle that Ruth is now trying to be part of. It's that family circle that we desire to be a part of. It's God's family. Now, interesting, Ruth is 4 chapters long, 3 pages in your Bible. And nowhere else in the Bible is there as wide a collection of family dynamics as there is in the book of Ruth. Things like grandparents and sons and daughters and brothers and sisters-in-laws and mother-in-laws. Nowhere else in Scripture do we have this many contained in one book. We have mothers, we have fathers, we have sons, daughters, brothers, brother-in-law, or daughter-in-law, mother-in-law, sister-in-law, husband, and wife. Now, these are only the ones that are named. Right? These are the ones that God gives a direct name to as he's building this family. I think in those 4 pages, those 4 chapters, God covers most of the family relations. And even though they're not named by name, you also have a grandmother and a grandfather. Other things are there, but as far as named mentions, there's nowhere else in the Bible that there's such a wide selection of family members mentioned. Because it goes back to this principle in the book of Ruth that's all about building the family of God. So all these relationships in a family unit have different responsibilities. They play off each other in different ways. And I think understanding how God wants that to work can help us not only in our family life, but in our ecclesial life, because we have roles and responsibilities in the ecclesia that are shown in these family units. So we're going to take a few minutes, and we're going to look at some of these relationships, and we're going to take out that piece of paper I gave out earlier, and look at how the family units are defined in the Scripture, how these members are meant to be. So the first thing we look at is the word for mother in Hebrew. So the word for mother is the word im. It's made up of 2 Hebrew letters, an aleph and a mem. So you look at that piece of paper or on the screen behind me. The aleph stands for ox, strength, and a leader. Mem is water, blood, chaos. So literally, what the word for mother means in Hebrew is strong water. What is strong water? How does that connect to the role of a mother in a family? Well, to a Hebrew mind, strong water is glue. The word im also means glue as much as it means mother. Because when we think of the mother's role in the family unit, it's her job is to hold the family together. Right? She is that emotional rock at the center of every family. Right? She supports every aspect of what's going on. She has that ability to understand the emotional state of everyone. So as mothers in a family, that's part of your role, is to make sure that we are the glue that holds our families together through trial and sorrow. And in the ecclesia, that same role has to apply. It's part of the role. I mean, I think the sisters in the background are holding things together because they're there to support the entire ecclesia. So we need to think that way. In our family, in the household of God, one of the roles of a sister, of a mother in the ecclesia, is to be the glue. It's to hold things together when times are stressful. Not from the platform necessarily, well, not, but from the background. Right? They're always at work, working out those relationships, right? Smoothing out situations. There's a role to play, and it's an important one. So how about the Hebrew word for father? It's the word ab or av. What two letters do we have in that word? Anybody want to look at the paper hazard a guess? You have what's the X letter look like? Or make it more interactive. What's that? Aleph, right. And it stands for the ox again, so strength, leadership, right, power. And the other letter is bet. And that stands for the tent, the house, to be within. So literally, the word for father means the strength of the house. So think of the nomadic lifestyle again. They lived in tents. So what is the strength of the tent? Well, it's the tent poles, right? It's the tent poles, which is what the Hebrew word for father actually also means. It means tent pole. It's what gives the tent support. It's what gives the tent structure. And that's the role of the father in the family. Right? It's to provide that strength for the family, to provide structure and support. That's true in the family unit, just as it's true in the ecclesial unit, as the elders work to provide that strength and support to the ecclesia. A role we have to see and take part in to make sure our tents stand strong. That falls to the brother and to the father. All right, the Hebrew word for son, it's the word ben. We have the word bet and the word noon, a letter bet and letter noon. Any guesses how that would work together? What are we talking about when we talk about a son? Well, the role of the son is to what? Continue the family, right? The family continues through the son. So you have bet, which again is the house, the family, it's the house, and noon. What does noon stand for? Well, it stands for the idea of continuing. So the son is the continuing of the house, the enlarging of the house. Because as your sons married and had their families, that was added to that family circle. So now your circle of tents expands and goes wider and wider. Your family grows. Now what the Hebrews did, or the nomadic life did to their tents, as the tents grew, they added strips to the tent. More panels and more panels and more panels. The word ben, which is also related to the Hebrew word for building, because it's through the sons that the house is built. So as sons in the ecclesia, we're looking to expand and build the ecclesia. We have a responsibility to be working to build our ecclesias, providing shelter for more and more people to come within God's house. That's done by instructing and uplifting and encouraging. That's the role of the sons of our family, both in the family unit and the ecclesial unit. Okay, well, how about the word for brother? The word for brother is the word ach, and it means, so it has an aleph again, so strength, and chet, which is the idea of a wall, as you can see from the picture. So the brother is the idea of the strong wall. Because again, remember that wall of tents that's in a circle, as it expands, the role of the brother was to protect the family. Right? They were the younger ones. Their job was to make sure that everyone was safe. Well, the same is true in our ecclesial life, isn't it? The roles of the brethren is to protect the ecclesia, right? To make sure the right standards are kept, the right doctrine is held to, the right moral application is upheld. There's a role there to be had in the protectors of the family unit for the brethren. Well, how about the word for daughter? Anybody know what the word for daughter is in Hebrew? So it's the word bath. It's actually the exact same word as the word you see in Bethlehem. That's house. And the letters you have there are the bet, the house, and tav, which is the letter for the covenant. Because what does it daughters do? How do daughters enlarge the family unit? Well, in marriage covenants. Right? So in Hebrew, the word for daughter is also the word for small town, the satellite villages of the larger cities. Bethlehem, Bethel, Beth-Shemesh, etc. On we go. Now, they started off as small satellite towns of larger cities. They grew into their own cities in their own right as time goes on. But that's what the daughter does, right? She becomes part of the house, or part of the family, through covenant. Well, brothers, that's us. We are those daughters that want to enter into the family of God, and we do that through covenant, through marriage to our Lord and Master, through Christ. That's how we become part of that circle of tents, that family of God, as we enter into a covenant with his Son. Now, I think the only daughter-in-law we have, I think it's just Skip and Carol and Debbie, right? I think in the room directly for daughter-in-laws and in-laws. Is that the only one? But I think many of you might have a daughter-in-law, or maybe have in-laws in your life. Oh, who else we got? Okay. So we probably have maybe a daughter-in-law in our lives, or maybe some of the sisters have in-laws. And that relationship we often think of with smiles and laughs, because it can be a difficult relationship. But there is a principle behind that relationship, right? Can we think of the Hebrew word for daughter-in-law as the word keilah, like Kayla. And we think of that relationship between daughter-in-law and the in-laws. That woman has that relationship with nobody else. She might have sisters and her own parents. She might have sister-in-laws, but that relationship with her in-laws is its own relationship. Now, the Hebrew word keilah, it literally means to become complete. We think about it, we look at our family unit. We have our sons, we give them to marriage, in marriage to a young woman. And oftentimes, parents have a hard time letting go of their children. Or maybe the sons have a hard time letting go of their parents. It's hard to say. And you have to trust now somebody else will take care of your son. Somebody else to do the things that you've done for them for 20 years or however long they've been in your house. And it can be hard for parents to let go of those kind of things. It can be hard for the son to take himself away from that situation. But what the daughter-in-law does for her husband is that she makes his house complete. She finishes that house. Because he is starting a new house, yes, within that circle of family, but it's a new house. And that word keilah means to complete the tent, to finish it off. Because in the principle that these two shall become one flesh. Right? And it's not that the man leaves behind his family and goes to live with a daughter where his wife lives. That's actually not the biblical principle. I mean, we read the verse earlier in the day, right, that a man will leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife. But literally, that's not what happened. They stayed in the same family group because the family all ran through the male household. That's where his livelihood was with his family. I think all examples of Scripture, where are the women always going? To the man's house. Right? Jacob doesn't stay with Laban. Jacob leaves. Rebekah goes down to Isaac. Right? Bathsheba goes into David's house. The woman always goes to the man's house. What does it mean then? He has to leave his father and mother behind. Because that relationship, that family unit now, is become separate. You have your own family unit now, husband and wife. And it's completed by that marriage between the man and the woman. So now the mother-in-law and the father-in-law have to trust that daughter-in-law will give the right relationship to their son, completing that family unit. So when we think about our relationship as daughter-in-laws or sometimes son-in-laws, we have to complete that family and be our own and stand on our own within the larger family unit, to be sure. But you are now your own separate household, a woman and a husband cleaving one to another and starting their own family. But what about the relationship from the other perspective? So that's what the mother-in-law has to trust the daughter-in-law to complete their son's life, to become one flesh, as it were. But now the mother-in-law has to provide a service for her daughter-in-law. So the word for mother-in-law is the word kamath. The root of the word is the word het and the word mem. It's the idea of being warm or to be hot. And what the mother-in-law has to provide then for that daughter-in-law who's left her family behind, Rebekah has left her parents, come down into the house, although I guess Sarah wasn't alive at that point. But they leave behind their own family, and now the in-laws, the mother-in-laws, have to provide warmth. Right? Think that you leave everything behind, your own family, to join a new family. It's hard. It's not easy. It's difficult. So as in-laws, we have to provide warmth, a loving environment, right? Companionship, advice. I don't know what to do with so-and-so. I can't understand why he behaves this way, why he thinks that way. Who do you turn to? You should turn to your in-laws. They've raised that young man for 25 years or whatever it's been. They know how he thinks and how he acts and what he does. That's the relationship you want to foster and build. Right? You should be able to find warmth, not adversity, not butting heads. And it takes submission from both sides, doesn't it? Right? The in-laws have to allow their daughter-in-law to complete that family unit. And the daughter-in-law has to trust the in-laws that they can go to them for advice and seek out the counsel of their elders. And there's a beautiful relationship that can be built there if we do it on the right principles, on godly principles. That's the way he lays out these things to be done for us. So we can see in the book of Ruth all these different family members coming together to form that family unit. And we can see each of us in different roles. Things that we have to do, whether it's to keep the family together as the glue or to be the strength of the tent as the tent pole. You have a role to play in your family life, in your ecclesial life. And you have to figure out what it is. And the moment you have the opportunity to do it, right, the moment Ruth woke up in the morning, she put herself to that work. That's how we have to be in our ecclesias. Finding any excuse to put ourselves to service, to fulfill those responsibilities that God lays out for us. That's how it all works out, isn't it, brothers and sisters? It's not what I can do for myself, how I can elevate my own standing in the family, but it's about how I can elevate everyone else's. And we have that outward focus, the family works together, and it grows together as one unit. And that's how it works in the house of God. We talked about last class at the very end, as Ruth comes home with Naomi, they came in the beginning of barley harvest. And we talked a little bit that barley represents the first fruits, the saints coming into the ecclesia. We're going to skip through this next couple slides. All right. So she comes in time of barley harvest. And at the end of chapter 2, we're told that she stays gleaning in the house of Naomi to the end of barley harvest and of wheat harvest. So what time in the Jewish calendar are we talking about? Well, we're talking about 2 specific months in the Jewish year. Barley harvest takes place in the month Abib, which is the first month of the religious calendar in the Jewish life. And the wheat harvest takes place in the second month, in the month Ziph. So the story of Ruth and Boaz takes place over 60 days. 60 days of Ruth constantly getting up in the morning, going to glean in Boaz's field, and bring the food back to her mother-in-law. Time and time again. But why? Why these time periods? Well, what goes on in those first 2 months of the Jewish calendar? What events are happening in the Jewish lifestyle that maybe reflect the same events that are going on in the life of Ruth? Well, we know in the month of Abib we have Passover, right? We have the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And then in the month Ziph, we have the Feast of Weeks, ending with the Day of Pentecost. So these events are all going along in the background of the story of Ruth, because Ruth and the changes in her life are going to mirror what's going on in these different feasts. You can see in the Feast of the Passover, it's all about salvation from the world, isn't it? It's at Passover time that you put the red on your doors, as where it started in Exodus chapter 10 to 12. It's all about salvation from the world. Well, when does Ruth come into the ecclesia? When does she come out of Moab into Bethlehem? The time of Passover. Right? She's delivered from the world. The Feast of Unleavened Bread, what's that all about? Right? Don't let the leaven come into the house. It's about separation from the world. Well, that's going on at the beginning again in the month Abib, when Ruth had left behind her family. She separated herself from the world and joined herself to God, mirroring the same events of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And then she works day after day after day out in the field, getting the grain for her family, all throughout the Feast of Weeks. It's all about working in service to Yahweh. Because once we are saved from the world and separate ourselves from it, we've got to put our hands to the plow. We've got to be working in the ecclesia. Because if you stop working in the ecclesia, you're falling away. It might not happen right away. It might happen over a series of days, months, years. But as soon as you stop working in your ecclesia, you are falling away from the truth. And there's Ruth, putting herself every day, all throughout the Feast of Weeks. And also culminating in the day of Pentecost, the day when the saints are elevated, when the tongues of fire came on the apostles' head. About the elevation of the saints. What happens at the end of the 60 days? She marries Boaz. She's redeemed from the flesh. She's elevated as a saint. So the life of Ruth mirrors, over these 60 days, the feasts and the activities that are going on in the Ecclesia of God. All playing out for us as God links all these events together. The same things that we have to play out in our own lives. As Ruth, who are walking out of Moab into Bethlehem, we have to go through that same way of thinking. So we're told in verse 17 that as she worked in the field, when she had gleaned, it was about an ephah of barley. So God, again, very specific. Her first day of work, she got an ephah of barley. Well, how much is that exactly? Well, Exodus 16, verse 36. An omer is the 10th part of an ephah. So an ephah is made up of 10 omers. Okay, why does that matter? Well, Exodus 16. This is the thing which Yahweh hath commanded. Gather it, speaking of the manna, of every man according to his eating. An omer for every man according to the number of your people. Take you every man for them which are in his tents. So every day, when the people were collecting manna, it was 1 omer per person. So how much did Ruth collect that first day? Well, an ephah, which is how many omers? 10 omers. Who was she collecting for? Herself? No, herself and Naomi. So she collected enough that one day for 5 days' food. 5 for her and for Naomi. Again, God is very pointed and very specific. The chapter opens up with Ruth saying to Naomi, I need to find grace in the sight of somebody. We know 5, the number in Scripture that stands for the principle of grace. All this is playing out in this chapter. That God's grace is at work in the life of Ruth, in the life of Naomi, in the life of Boaz to bring together this family of God. 5 days worth. God's grace is in effect. But what is grace? You know, grace is one of those principles we talked about earlier. You can't really draw it for me on a piece of paper. It's a very abstract term, but it's going to have a concrete meaning in Hebrew. Right? There's something in the way that they think is going to apply to the principle of grace. Sorry. There's just a couple of verses that talk about grace. And I think there's a bit of a pattern here. So Genesis 6, verse 8, but Noah found grace in the eyes of Yahweh. That contrasts to earlier in the chapter when, what do the wicked find? Destruction because of their wickedness. Genesis 18, verse 3, and said, my Lord, if I have found favor, that's grace, in thy sight, pass not away, I pray thee, from thy servant. Genesis 19:19, behold now, thy servant hath found grace in thy sight, and thou hast magnified thy mercy, which thou hast showed unto me in saving my life. Genesis 30:27, and Laban said to him, I pray thee, if I have found favor in thine eyes, tarry, for I have learned by experience that Yahweh hath blessed me for thy sake. Genesis 33:8, and he said, what meanest thou by all this drove which I met? And he said, these are to find grace in the sight of my Lord, as Jacob spoke to Esau. Genesis 39:4, and Joseph found grace in the sight of Potiphar and served him, and he made him overseer over his house, and all that he had he put into his hand. So look at the context of every one of those verses, and you can expand this and keep going throughout the Old Testament and how the word grace is used. And really what it's talking about, in very simple terms, is acceptance. Right? The wicked weren't accepted by God, and they were destroyed. Noah, because he walked with God, he was righteous, God accepted Noah, and he was given life. Right? Laban said to Jacob, if I found acceptance, if I'm acceptable to you, stay with me because you're helping me. So at its basic form, grace is all about finding acceptance in the eyes of somebody else. Because that's what we're looking for. We're looking for acceptance in God's sight. Acceptance into his greater family, as it were. Now, the Hebrew word grace is the word chen. It's made of these 2 letters on the board. Het and the noon, right? So it's the wall that continues. The word chanan, which is another word used for grace. Same idea. Not coming. There we go. So remember our idea of a Hebrew family living in a group of tents. The word for grace actually literally means an encampment. Because it's the family unit. When we're finding acceptance in God's sight, what he's really saying, I accept you into my family. I accept you into my group of tents that lives on this earth. Remember, the whole earth we fill with the knowledge of the glory of God. So when God is talking about grace in our life, he's talking about accepting us into that family, into that circle of tents. In fact, eventually I'll get there. The word kala, which I'm trying to show on the screen. There we go. It means to incline. By implication, to decline by the slanting of rays of evening, specifically to pitch a tent or to encamp. So when we look at the word khan and all its associated words, you have this idea of setting up the tent, setting up the circle of the family. Because it's exactly what God is trying to do. By his grace, by accepting us, he is bringing us into that family unit, into the household of faith, into the kingdom on earth. All these principles come into play. Here's a lexicon definition of the word grace in the Hebrew. So the active is camp, concrete is camp, abstract is beauty. The pictograph for noon is a picture of a wall. This is the picture of a seed, meaning to continue. Combine these mean the wall that continues. A nomad's camp consists of many family tents, which make up the clan camp. The camp may have as many as 50 tents or more in it. And these tents are placed in a circular configuration, forming one continuous wall surrounding the camp. It's where our English word home comes from, actually, is the word chan in Hebrew. So when God talks about his grace and how his grace has effect in our lives, what he's really talking about is whether or not he accepts us into that family unit. And that's what's going on in the life of Ruth. It's her actions, it's her decision to separate herself, to leave behind everything else, that's going to allow God or enable God to accept her into his family, into that circle of tents that he set up. Acts 20 and 32, now, brethren, I commend you to God and to the word of his grace, which is able to build you up and to give you an inheritance among them which are sanctified. That's the effect of grace. Grace builds us up and gives us that inheritance in the family of God. It's that acceptance in God's sight. If we would, like Noah, as we read in our readings, walk with God, if we are just, if we are upright, if we obey the commands of the Father, all these things is what God is looking for us to develop as he brings us into his family, into that family unit. So we think, here we go. Ruth gets up in the morning. She heads out. And if you look at verse 3 of Ruth chapter 2, and she went and came and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and her hap was to light on a part of the field belonging to Boaz. When we read that in English, it kind of seems like, oh, happy accident, she got to Boaz's camp. But that's not what it's saying at all. I mean, we know that. We know that nothing comes by chance to the faithful. But God was hard at work. That word there, hap, means something that's meant, something that happens. The word light means to light upon, it says chiefly by accident, but also to bring about. Just to come to Daniel 10, verse 14, and we see how that word is used in the book of Daniel. It's not a word that's used a lot in the Old Testament. So when it is used, it kind of gives us an idea what God intends it to be. So in Daniel 10, and in verse 14, read the following. Now I am come to make thee understand what shall befall thy people in the latter days. For yet the vision is for many days. That word there, befall, is the same word kara, meaning to light. Now, Strong's defines it as accident, but that's not what's going on here in Daniel. In verse 14 there, these things befall the people because God intended them to befall the people. Because God had it all laid out for his purpose. It's prophetic. Exactly the way that Ruth was meant to find the camp or the family of Boaz. She was right where she needed to be. It wasn't luck. It wasn't chance. It was God's plan unfolding. She was meant to find that field. Exactly the way God wanted it to be. What time is this class over, by the way? Anybody know? Nope. I don't know when we started. 10 after? Good time? Okay. I don't know. All right. So she's right where God wanted her to be. She comes into this tent, into this family, and they have this discussion. And again, in Ruth's words, in Ruth 2, verse 10, and she fell on her face, she bowed herself to the ground, and says to him, "Why have I found grace in thy sight, that thou shouldst take knowledge of me, seeing I am a stranger?" She recognizes the fact that she found grace in the sight of Boaz. Boaz accepted her. He allowed her into his family, as it were. And she's blown away by this. Right? She's blown away because she's a stranger. She's an alien from the Commonwealth of Israel. And I think she knew her Bible. Right? This is the one thing that Naomi definitely would have coached her on entering into Israel, is that it's going to be hard. In our laws, actually, we speak about your people. Deuteronomy 23:3, "An Ammonite or a Moabite shall not enter into the congregation of Yahweh, even to their 10th generation shall they not enter into the congregation of Yahweh forever." Why? Why have I found grace? What have I done to deserve this? And look, Boaz seems to know a lot what's going on. He says to her in verse 11, "It hath been fully shown to me all that you have done to thy mother-in-law since the death of thine husband, and how thou hast left thy father and thy mother, and land thy nativity, and hath come to a people which thou knowest not heretofore." How long had Ruth been in the city? Not even a day. Not even a day had gone by. But Boaz knows the whole story? Where did Boaz come from? Well, he came from the city. I'm going to make a suggestion that Naomi had already talked to Boaz. They were family friends, remember? Naomi had already started working behind the scenes to make sure that Ruth could find a place, find grace, find a home. Look at Naomi's reaction in verse 21. In verse 20. When she tells her all about the things that have happened. "The man's name who I have wrought today is Boaz." And Naomi says, "Blessed be he of Yahweh, who hath not left his kindness off to the living to the dead. This man is near kin to us." Naomi is so excited. Right away she knows, because she's already been talking to Boaz. How else would he know? How else could he know? I mean, I'm sure gossip is running around the city a little bit, but he knows everything that happened from the moment they left Moab all the way till now. Because they've been talking about this. They're friends. They're acquaintances, not just family. He's aware of this woman. And the reason why she finds grace in his sight is because he's seen her character. He's seen the things, the kindness, the chesed that she showed to Naomi. And all this is going on in the background of the story. He'd been in town for the morning having a conversation, not with Naomi, with somebody else about this woman. Because when he comes to the vineyard, think about it, or not the vineyard, in the field, there's people working all over the field, right? There's the reapers are doing their thing, there's maidens that are working, and yes, there's the poor and the widows working in the corners. He looks out, who's that one? It's almost like he's looking for Ruth. He picks her out right away. He's aware of who this woman is. And he wants to help her. He wants to make sure that she's looked after because he realizes the kind of woman that she is. She's not thinking about herself. And brothers and sisters, this is the amazing beauty of the truth. If we focus on our brothers and sisters, as Ruth is doing in the story, she's focused on Naomi. How can I make sure Naomi's looked after? If we truly commit ourselves to that, and all our lives just focus on what I can do for my brothers and sisters, how can I help? Where am I needed? If we're doing that, what are our brothers and sisters then doing for us? Well, they're reacting in kind. It perfectly works together in the house of God. So she's out there focused on Naomi, and how Boaz comes along, and he's focused on Ruth. That's how we should work out. No one's going to be left behind if we have that focus outwardly all the time, as Christ had for us. That's what Boaz is doing. He's looking, how can I help this young lady? And he finds grace in her sight. He's accepted to her because of her response. Because of what she does. You know, God is working in our lives. He's bringing us into his family. But we don't just sit there. God is looking for a response from us. And Ruth responds. Look what it says about her throughout this chapter 2. In verse 7, as he's talking to his men, they tell her, oh, she's been here working all since the morning until now, and she's tarried a little in the house. Some translations say she tarried not even a little in the house. Either way, she spent very little time resting. Her focus is out there in the field, working and working. After walking for a few days, leaving her family behind, she's bent over and harvesting wheat, or barley, as it is. That's how it is in the ecclesia. God's looking to bestow his grace upon us because we're out there working for our brothers and sisters. So he tells Ruth in verse 8, go not to glean in another field. If we want God to accept us into his family, we have to listen. Don't go to other field and glean. Don't go to the world, a different church, a different way of life, and glean there and work there. Only go to my field. If we want God to accept us, we need to apply ourselves to work in his field, as Boaz asked Ruth to work in his own field. And in doing that, look at verse 22. And Naomi says to Ruth, Ruth, it is good, my daughter, that thou go out with his maidens. So not only are we working for others in the field of God, or the field of Boaz, but we're doing it with the other maidens, the other members of the ecclesia. We're working hand in hand. It's not a job you do alone, brothers and sisters. God has not left you on an island. He's filled your life with an ecclesial family that you can rely on and that you can work with. But he expects you to work with that family. Not to go somewhere else and look for other people to work with, to fill your life with the Moabites. No, fill your life with the members of the ecclesia. Work side by side in the field with them. And that's what Ruth does. And if we can do those things, Boaz says to Ruth in verse 12, that Yahweh will recompense your work, and a full reward shall be given to thee of Yahweh God of Israel, under whose wings thou hast come to trust. See, brothers and sisters, we have to realize the need for God to protect us. Yes, you're hard at work in the ecclesia life, and you're doing all these things, but recognize that you can't do it without God. You have to place yourself in a position of vulnerability, realizing that you can't do it alone, that God is needed to protect you. And Boaz recognized that Ruth has done that. She's put herself under God's trust because she's left everything else behind. Who else does she have? Naomi? Little old lady? No offense. That's not a lot to trust in, is it? But she trusts in God. She knows that God is there for her because she's walking with God. Verse 18, and she took it up and went to the city, and her mother-in-law saw that she had gleaned, and she brought forth, and she gave to her what she had reserved after she had sufficed. So she provided. So at the meal, when Boaz is providing her food and the parched corn, the nice stuff, she's eating of it, but she kept some back. She'd been traveling and working all day long, but she still kept some aside for Naomi, who she knew was waiting at home. We don't just hold the truth to ourselves, brothers and sisters. As much as we're focused on the ecclesia and working together in the vineyard, the truth needs to be shared. We need to proclaim the truth to the world. So the things that God has given us, that parched corn, we share it with others, with as many as we possibly can. But those interactions we have are always based upon that truth. The interactions we have as we outreach in the truth, I know your seminars have been going on really, really well. I keep hearing about how wonderful that is in the ecclesia. But that relationship you're building with the Moabites that are coming out, as it were, that relationship you're building with them as you bring them into your family, into your ecclesial world, it's built upon the truth. That's the foundation of it. It's not built upon because I work with Bob and I get along with Bob. We both enjoy sports and we play sports together, and that's our relationship. He doesn't much know about my religion, but we do get along really well. That's not a relationship that's going to grow to anything because it's not based on truth. It's not us sharing the things of God. That's what those relationships have to build on. So Ruth is willing to share what she has gained in the fields. Here's Ruth, worked all day long, traveled for the last couple days. And then in verse 17, after she gleans in the field, she now goes and she beats out all that she had gleaned. So even though Boaz has commanded his reapers, leave some in the corners. Right? Make sure she's looked after. Make it easier on her. And God does some ways make it easier on us, right? The truth is abundant. It's very easy to access God's word, whether it's in your Bible or in your palm of your hand or listening to a class. We have easy access to the truth, but we still have work to do. We have to beat it out. We got to apply ourselves to the same things. Even though Boaz is leaving the gleanings of corn throughout the field, Ruth had to beat it out. She had to get into it to make it useful for her, to make it apply to her life. She had to take an active role and active participation in that truth. Okay, we have a few minutes left. We're going to end it just in verse 1. When you're introduced to Boaz, we're told that he's a mighty man of wealth. Now that word for wealth is the word kail, and it's used only two other times in the book of Ruth. The next time we see it is in chapter 3, verse 11. When Boaz is talking to Ruth, and he says, "All the city shall know that thou art a virtuous woman." You know, Ruth is the only named virtuous woman in the Bible. And I would suggest whoever wrote Proverbs 31, that virtuous woman, based it upon the life of Ruth. She was the woman that he had in mind as he penned those words. So she was the virtuous man, and Boaz, we see, virtuous woman, he is the virtuous man. He was a man of virtue. So when we look through all the different virtues that come out of Proverbs, chapter 31, trustworthy, working willingly, bringing food, providing for others, arming her with strength, looking out for the poor. Her husband is known in the gates. Being industrious, clothed in strength and honor, has wisdom and kindness, not idle, and her husband praises her. All these different attributes that come out of Proverbs 31 are all found time and time again in the book of Ruth, in the way she conducts herself. These virtues show in the way that she lives her life. And if you look through, just a last thought before we close this evening, if you look through those different virtues, there's an overwhelming focus outward. It's what she's always doing for others. Ruth, as she makes this moral decision, she's made the mental choice to walk with Naomi, to leave behind the world, and now she's applying it morally in her life. It's an outward thing. It's about the service you can provide for your entire ecclesia, for your brothers and sisters. And she fully manifests that in every aspect of her life. So if we want to be a Ruth, as we come into the ecclesia or into the family of God, our focus needs to be on everyone else. Like Christ's focus was on saving his brothers and sisters, our focus is on saving our brothers and sisters, on lifting up others. Because if we can do that, when we are beset with trials, temptations, hardships, and we're making mistakes, right? We're succumbing to temptations in our life, and things aren't going well. If we can either focus on ourselves, like, oh, what am I going to do? I've failed. I can't pick myself up. I can't do it. If that focus is internally, you're right. You're not going to pick yourself up. But if you have built up a consistency of focusing on service to others, even when you're struggling, you're out helping other people, I'm suggesting that those struggles will come less and less and less because you're not focused on self. You're focused on everyone else in your ecclesia, and that's what Ruth was all about. Yeah, it would have been hard. She would have been homesick. She would have been tired. Easy time to make a mistake. But her focus was on Naomi, on what she could do to provide for others. So brothers and sisters, as we work in our ecclesias, as we find ourselves at meeting on a Sunday morning, look around. What can you do? How can you help to build a family of God?